Section 5 of A Rip van Winkle of the Kalahari, 7 Tales of Southwest Africa, by Frederick, Cornell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Leanne Fortune. The Pans and the Poison Flowers, Part 1. By this time the sun was high in the heavens, and I realized that if I would make a bid for life, I must do it soon. Buffeted and almost choked with the battle of the past night, I was parched with thirst, and had perforce to encroach upon the scanty store left to me, a bare court at the outside, barely sufficient to keep life in me another day in the terrible heat. The horses, too, were suffering, and would scarcely last that time, and I was now faced with the terrible problem as to whether I should attempt to return or to penetrate farther into the desert. To return would be difficult, for the storm had passed that way, and all our spurs would be obliterated. Moreover, we had gone out of our path so far, when following the fire, that I was by no means certain as to the absolute direction. Moreover, a glance that way showed me heavy, dun-coloured clouds on the far horizon. There the storm was raging still, and I shuddered to think of what my fate might be in the loose bare dunes we had passed through with such difficulty. Besides, though Inyati's awful fate appeared but too certain, I felt impelled to follow the direction he had gone, for there might, after all, be a faint hope that he had lived through the storm. But this alternative was a terrible one, for even if water had existed in the pans for which he was searching, it was all too probable that the storm would have filled up every pit with sand, and to penetrate so far would make return impossible. However, I could not remain where I was and die without a struggle. So, dividing the load as well as possible among the almost exhausted animals, I again entered the maze of dunes and struck due east, full of forebodings as to my own possible fate, and of sorrow for that of poor Inyati. For hours I stumbled through the bewildering mass of broken and barren dunes, finding no trace of vegetation, and full of apprehension lest the wind should rise before I reached the pan, in which case I was doomed. At long length, and when the afternoon was well advanced, a flat dark space showed between two dunes some distance ahead, and an hour later I stood upon the pan. No salt pan this time, but a flat circular floor of dry mud, hard and entirely free from the surrounding sand. Here and there a few stunted bushes grew, and in the centre of the circle, which was about a mile across, stood a huge herd of gemsbok. They made off at a canter as I rode wearily across to the depression in the centre, where I hoped to find water. But the shallow, hoof-trampled hollow was bone dry. There was no sign of Inyati either, and my heart sank as I realized that my struggle had been in vain. Anyway, here I must rest and eat, and drink a little of my tiny stock of water, and on the morrow make my last struggle on foot, for it was evident that the horses could go no further, and were dying of thirst. I threw off their light loads, and they stood with drooping heads and ears, the picture of dejection. A mouthful of water was all I dare drink, and there remained less than a pint in the water-skin. Almost stupefied, exhausted, and despondent, I lay down beside a tiny bush, at whose dry twigs the famished horses were now trying to nibble, and sank into a state of half-sleep, half-stupor. The sound of a shot aroused me from my lethargy. Had I been dreaming? No, there it was again. And now across the pan came streaming back the herd of gemsbok, and after them ran and stumbled a nude black figure that now and again paused to single out an animal and shoot. "Inyati! Inyati! Thank God!" I cried out, for it could be no other, and as fast as my aching limbs allowed, I hastened towards him. Now he was down beside one of the fallen animals, and his knife was at work, and now I realized why he had picked his victims, and had shot so many. It was not food he wanted, but drink, and he had shot only the cows, whose udders were full of rich, sweet milk. It was time, too, that he drank, for he could not speak, and his cracked and swollen lips and bloodshot eyes told a tale of awful suffering. Soon, however, he was able to talk. "The storm, master," he said. "Near was I to being buried alive, and I thought thee dead. Yet could I not return before, for I have found no water. The other pan is dry also, but now I have seen from far off a spot where water is, and so I hastened back to find my master. It is far, but we shall win through." Caught by the storm between the two pans, he had been hours staggering through the raging chaos, and had reached the pan only after the sun had risen and the storm had ceased, to find it without a vestige of water. Casting about in the dunes, he had searched for Tsamma without avail, and filled with anxiety for me, had been torn between a desire to return at once and the absolute necessity of finding water. Hurrying from one prominent dune to another, he had scanned the desert in all directions, and had even found one or two more pans, but again waterless. One, however, showed that it had held water recently, for it was still moist, and there he had found a flock of the tiny Namaqua partridge, so plentiful in certain parts of the desert. These little birds are swift of flight, and fly long distances in search of water, and Inyati, as they rose in a cloud from their old drinking place, had marked the direction of their flight. Northeast they went, and his keen eyes had followed them till they were no longer visible, and as he watched, he saw many other flocks, and all flying in the same direction. "There is the water," thought Inyati, and he had toiled on in their wake, but the way was far, and it was hours before, from a high dune, he had seen a large pan in the distance, to which all the birds were converging. "A big pan, master," he said, "with thick bush and big trees, an oasis, or perhaps, who knows, a river bed." And frantic with thirst as he was, he had not gone on, but turned back, hoping to find me alive. My heart leapt with joy at the news, for with the knowledge that water awaited us, we could struggle on. But the horses? Inyati shook his head as he examined them. "That one will die before morning," said he. "But maybe we can save the others, though they cannot carry us. We must eat, drink, and sleep, for the way is long, and we are weak. And now, master, if all the tobacco is not there under the big dune with the other packs, I will smoke, for I have missed my tobacco sadly." How he enjoyed himself, this light-hearted philosopher of the desert! Long steaks of tender gemsbok he cut and grilled on the wood ashes of the tiny fire, treating in a like manner the juicy udders after he had squeezed out most of the milk. The water he would not touch, but his appetite seemed unappeasable. Steak after steak disappeared, and still he carved and cooked, smoking between whiles, and singing some never-ending song of all the fine wives he would buy, and what he would do to certain priests if he got his little gun safe to his own country. His cheery presence and the reliance I placed in him cheered me enormously, and I realized that I too was hungry, and so we ate and smoked and slept till nearly midnight, and then, keeping the Southern Cross low down on the horizon on our right, we once more entered the dunes. The horse that Inyati had referred to was obviously dying, and a merciful bullet put an end to the poor brute's sufferings. The others trudged wearily after us, making but slow progress, but doing better than I had conceived possible of animals that had not eaten or drank for 36 hours. But morning found them dead beat. They stood stock still as the sun rose, and neither coaxing nor flogging could get the poor brutes a step farther. According to Inyati's reckoning, we were still 4 hours from the water, and it was obvious that once we left them, we could never hope to save them, for we could never bring back enough water to keep them alive. "There is but one thing," said Inyati, as he slipped their loads off. "Water we cannot bring them, nor would it be in time, for once the sun is hot, they will die. But stay here, and I will search for a certain thing. Nay, master," he continued, for I had made a gesture of dissent, "this time I go not far. But here I see rain has fallen of late, and though there is no Tasama, there may be another thing that will save the horses." "Then I will seek it with you, Inyati," I said, for I was determined not to lose sight of him again. "Better rest, master," he urged. "There will be no more sandstorms, and there is still far to go." But go I would, and so we left the poor horses standing in a forlorn little group, gazing with sad, lacklustre eyes at the masters who had brought them to such a plight. Inyati took with him a canvas bag that had been used as a saddle-cloth, and I wondered what he hoped to find to fill it, for there was no vestige of vegetation to be seen, except some tiny seeds just sprouting here and there in the hollows between the dunes. I could see no other evidence of the rain that Inyati spoke of, but soon, in a deeper depression than usual, we found signs that water had recently accumulated there, though the spot was now as dry as the surrounding dunes. But here Inyati, who had been keenly examining the ground, uttered a grunt of satisfaction, and pointed to a spot close to his feet. There was no trace of a plant, but a slight swelling, as it were, of the soil, which showed, too, some small cracks, as though something was trying to burst its way to the surface. "Kameelbrod," said he, and kneeling down, he commenced scooping away the sand with his hands, and from a few inches below the surface he soon drew a whitish tuber, the size of a large turnip. It was full of thin watery juice, acrid and sharp to the taste, but as I afterwards found, extremely acceptable to the horses. Soon we had the bag nearly full, and cutting them up on our waterproof ground sheet, we quickly had a quantity of watery pulp, at which the animals nuzzled greedily, and which revived them to a remarkable extent almost at once. So much so, indeed, that we had very little difficulty in hurrying them forward again. The last drop of water had long since gone, and I was now consumed with thirst, and sick with misgiving as to what might be found at the pan Inyati had seen. Now we could see it, and as yesterday, the flocks of partridges were all flying in that direction. How I envied them their wings, and how I grudged them the precious water they would be drinking. At length, footsore, weary, with eyes scorched by the blinding glare of the sun on the bare sand, and with lips cracked and tongues swollen with thirst, we staggered out of the dunes into a wide pan covered with bush and sprinkled with big trees, huge kameeldoorn of thick verdant foliage, which gave the whole expanse a park-like appearance. They were full of gay plumaged birds. Butterflies were flitting everywhere. Here and there were fine stretches of thick grass. In fact, after all we had suffered in the furnace of shadeless sand behind us, the place was a veritable paradise. And at length, where the trees were thickest, we espied tall green reeds growing thickly, and a few minutes later our fears were at an end, for here was water in plenty. It was thick and muddy and fouled by wild animals, whose spoors showed thick all around it, but to us it was absolute nectar, and it needed all Inyati's persuasion to prevent me from drinking to excess and probably dying on the spot. We had to control the horses too, and let them drink but little at a time, or they too would probably have drank till they dropped dead in their tracks. End of section 5. Recording by Leanne Fortune, South Africa.